Welcome to Overeducated and Underemployed. I'm Feddun, and I'm here today after taking a week off to upgrade some equipment here in the studio. We had a launch party, and it dawned on me that a lot of these interviews are paired with performances. So I upgraded some equipment, and we're going to actually do a live recording of an interview podcast here coming up. You'll hear more about it in the future, but this will be the first of many. We're going to do an interview in front of a studio audience. That'll be really interesting. I'm looking forward to that. Later on this week, we've got Levi Crumley. He's a comedian out of Athens, Georgia, that he produces a lot of shows. He is somebody who is also a musician, and he's juggles working full-time, being a musician, producing these shows. So that was an interesting conversation. I look forward to hearing it. Today, we are going to talk about music games. The Nintendo Switch 2 is coming out, and with it has a mouse function on the new and improved ones. I cannot help but think that they must release Mario Paint back on the Super Nintendo Virtual Console to work with this mouse function. It begs for it. Mario Paint was the first kind of creative sandbox that I remember ever being on a console and that having extended access to, period. I feel like there was a few on PCs, but I didn't have a PC yet. In a lot of ways, Mario Paint made your Super Nintendo feel like a PC. So they got me thinking about all the music games that I have played over the years, ones I still play, new ones coming out still, and ones I haven't played yet, but I'm excited to play. And I gotta say, it probably all started with Mario Paint. I'm also going to talk later on in the episode about real-world applications for some of these games. One criticism I remember hearing a lot in college was, oh, if you spent that much time playing real guitar as you do playing Guitar Hero, you could maybe be a real guitarist. No, I think there's a lot of reasons why, A, that's probably not always true. B, people spent way less time playing Guitar Hero than you probably think they did compared to somebody who needs to learn to play guitar and takes a lot of time doing that. And lastly, I'd really say that not Guitar Hero in particular, but there are certainly music games out there that have real-world applications, whether musical or otherwise, and we'll talk about that too. So Mario Paint was more than just a version of Paint, more than just like Photoshop or Microsoft Paint on a console, but it was full of mini games, the ability to draw pictures, the ability to make animations, the ability to make music, and you could even put it all together and make a little mini film with the music you made and the little composer. Today I'm going to focus on the little composer, which is probably the thing I spent the most time with anyway. You basically had a musical staff and you had a few MIDI sounds, and this is all from memory. I have not played this game in a long time. If they do put it out on the Virtual Console, I will do an entire episode dedicated to Mario Paint and reliving its glory. But as far as I remember, you had a handful of sounds that you could use that then you could put in different notes on the scale. And you had like a certain number of measures that you could do. And I feel like it topped out at 30 seconds or something like that when it was all said and done. But what was able to happen was you were able to compose your own music right there on the Super Nintendo using a variety of different sounds and using a variety of different time measurements and things like that. I do think that there was a lot of limitations involved, but if you go online even today, you can see a lot of creative things being done. And that's a theme you've probably heard already a lot of in this podcast, is that sometimes constraint can be good for creativity. And having a certain set of parameters is required in order to not get lost in rabbit holes. And sometimes just not being able to do something makes you come up with a more creative way of doing it. So I think there were some really amazing things made in Mario Paint, just like you've seen amazing things made in Minecraft and every other kind of simple sandbox game. This was in a lot of ways the first sandbox game. You can make little animations and you can make music, you can make movies with it in that sense. But there was a fly swatting game. It really, I feel like it essentially taught kids how to use a mouse. But the music game really just a little composition maker was really fun. And then the next game that I got into that would be considered like a straight up music game, and I played this incessantly. And I'm going to talk about both of these games as one game just because the machines were right next to each other at my arcade. Essentially the same game with a different footpad layout, but I'm going to talk about Dance Dance Revolution and Pump It Up. Now, Pump It Up was just a Korean company that made a dance game akin to Dance Revolution. If Dance Revolution had the four directions, up, down, left, Pump It Up had pads in the opposite places. So there was one in the middle, and then there was one in the four corners. Think about a 5 on a die, where DDR looked more like a control pad on a Nintendo. So you had the ability to have totally different moves. There was different music licensed. Very little crossover because one was a Japanese company and one was a Korean company. And it was actually the first foray of K-pop into the United States that I was ever aware of. I'm sure that it wasn't the first, but that was the first time me and a lot of my friends ever heard K-pop. And I gotta say, it never really stuck for me, but there was music in that game that I came away really liking, including like a remix of Beethoven's Ninth or something like that, or Beethoven's Fifth, I can't remember. But it introduced me also to the concept of classical music. And I'm talking, I was like 8, 9, 10 years old at this point, of classical music being able to be more than just classical music and not just being stuck in a box. And that remix stuck with me. There was a couple of K-pop songs that I can't remember now, but I remember I didn't go buy the album or anything, but I enjoyed listening to them when other people played the same song on the game. And I will say though that eventually I think dance games did get me into some music that I never would have listened to, and that music that I did listen to independently of the game. And I'll talk about that when we get there, but I don't think this game got me into any music that I went and listened to out on my own. That hadn't happened yet, but it did get me into music and make me appreciate music that I don't think I ever would have been exposed to at that age, certainly. And also, it was certainly never anything that was on the radio at that point. And this was long before streaming services or really the internet had much ability to share music at all. So at a certain point, it just becomes this issue where, so at a certain point, I think like any exposure to music you wouldn't hear otherwise is good, especially if you end up digging it. But as somebody who wasn't like super into anime, wasn't seeking out Japanese or Korean pop, it exposed me to a whole different world of music that I only really listened to when playing the game, but I played that game a lot. And then I think it really set me up for just being really open-minded about music in a way that even when I got to work at independent record stores, I felt like on some levels, I was more open to different things than they were because a lot of my coworkers be a lot more closed-minded about pop and what it could be or couldn't be. And don't get me wrong, a lot of it was garbage, but because it was such a like independent vibe, anything that had clean production was really dismissed. But I think that, and then working at those stores is what really set me up to have such a diverse taste in music.
And I think that really leads me nicely into the next game or series of games that I was obsessed with. There were several Dance Revolution games and Pump It Up games, but came Guitar Hero and Rock Band. And Guitar Hero was fun, but I think I really started to enjoy it when the full band setup came out. You could essentially have karaoke along. I'd always been a fan of karaoke personally, but then also the drum set was really great. And I think of all the instruments in Rock Band that I played, I never did play the edition with keyboards, but of all the instruments that I played in Rock Band, I would say that the drums were most like playing the real instrument. But the nice thing about the multiplayer is people with no musical inclination, or people that liked karaoke, or people that just wanted to watch other people goof around. I think there was a kind of a place for everybody in your friend group with that game. I would have groups of people over. We'd rotate out band members. Some of us would just watch. Some of us would sing harmonies. I remember when Beatles Rock Band came out. It was the first one that had harmonies built into the game. And we spent a lot of time with that. It was neat. And it was also, I think, the first one that allowed you to build like kind of set lists where you could play like one song after the other without a pause or a break. And they would let you play like sequences from Beatles albums. And I just thought that was always a lot of fun. We really, the Beatles Rock Band kind of was set apart, I think, from the rest of Rock Band and Guitar Hero. And there's really, they were made by the same people or the same company, and just a lot of rights got bounced around, and some of it was like controllers, and some of it was the company that made controllers eventually started making games. But at the end of the day, they made a really long-lasting series of games that I still play Rock Band 4, or maybe it's Guitar Hero. I think it's Rock Band. Once in a blue moon now, I still have a setup for it. But I think like it was the multiplayer, much like with Dance Revolution and Pump It Up, like there was multiplayer game like modes. Like I remember a competition we had at our local arcade where people would do like routines where they ended up switching pads in the middle of the dance and things like that. And then with Rock Band, you had the same kind of collaboration. Just say what you will about the technical aspects of it, but I think it really did capture what it feels like to play with a group of people, especially when you got in sync and the singer nailed it. It was a lot of fun. And I don't know that there was much practicing going involved except maybe singing or drumming, but the guitar, you really just were getting some basic rhythm skills and nothing else. And I think, if anything, it did help me as like a non-player. And I never learned to play guitar very well because I'm left-handed. I only had right-handed teachers. They didn't really know what to do with me. Hit a ceiling very quickly every time I learned how to play. And I just think it was harder for me to learn than a lot of other people. I have big hands, big meaty hands that can be difficult. But I think Guitar Hero was a good outlet for me to learn what guitar parts sounded like by themselves. Songs sound really weird when you miss the guitar solos in Guitar Hero. So you learn to pick them out really well. And then, I don't know, I think it did change the way I listen to music a little bit. Just listening to all the different parts a little bit more individually. And that game was more than just a game, or it was something we did pretty frequently for a few years where we'd have get-togethers based around it. Multiple groups of friends, too, at different points in time. I think there's something to be said about feeling like you're part of the music. I think video games are all about living out fantasy. It definitely did a pretty good job of letting you live out the rock star fantasy to an extent. Certainly like the garage band fantasy, even if you had no musical talent. But I think what's important is like the tactile feeling of feeling like you had an impact on the music by what you were doing. So if you missed a guitar part or note, you didn't hear that note played in the song on screen. And that created some group dynamics too. It was like, oh man, you fucked that part up and we all wanted to hear it or whatever. But I think there's also like an aspect of it where it was like competitive, but we all still rooted each other on because we were part of the same band. But I think it captured something that not a lot of other games really had captured yet, where what you did impacted how the game sounded, in the sense that with Dance Revolution, I feel like if you missed dance parts, I don't feel like it skipped parts of the song. If you missed a certain number, you'd fail out. But I don't recall there being like a certain amount where you just had to get the note to. I feel like there wasn't any part of the game where it stopped playing the song just based on the actual steps you missed. I've also dabbled in games like Just Dance, but then I really got into a game that exists on console, PC, but I think the ultimate version of it is in virtual reality, called Tetris Effect Connected. Now, the gameplay is just Tetris, but in the same way that Guitar Hero makes you have a tactile connection to the music, Tetris Connected actually really takes it to a whole new level. Every time you move a piece, it creates some synesthesia in the background and affects notes and sounds based on whatever level and song you're playing. Each level is a different song. And the music is from all over the world. And the song progresses as you clear lines. And so clearing the lines in rhythm is very satisfying. But also, every time you move a piece, it affects the background. Not just colors, but the way things move and what you hear. And so it creates this whole complete experience of sound and color and tactile feeling where just rotating a Tetris piece has a huge impact on the environment around you. And you play through the levels and they get increasingly more difficult. And you reach a meditative state, I must say. You start to have the Tetris effect right there in the game where you're just in the zone. And I think the music aids you in getting there very quickly. It also turned me on to some music I'd never listened to before. Music that I have gone back and listened to outside of the game. And the next two games I'm going to talk about are also virtual reality. And one of them is debatably not even a game, but Tetris Effect Connected is the finest example of how a regular game can incorporate music to make it more than what it was before. And a game that's 40 years old plus remains super fresh. Because at its core, the gameplay is still just Tetris. Beat Saber is a game that I've played a lot of in virtual reality as well. A lot of y'all are probably familiar with it. You have lightsabers in your hands. You slice blocks to the rhythm of music as they fly at you in a 3D space in virtual reality. Once again, the tactile feeling of slicing through the blocks on rhythm, there's haptic feedback in the controllers. You do feel it when you slice through the blocks. They're flying at your face, moving faster than you can really turn to look at. And once again, you get into kind of a meditative dance space. And this game has gotten me into artists that I'd heard and didn't really even care about. It's not like I'd never heard of them before. But I got into their music because their levels in Beat Saber were just so fun that listening to their music later, it was almost just like a Pavlovian association where I was like, oh my God, I like this because I had fun playing this level. And I started to understand at that point in my life, I'm not a person that goes to the club to go dancing or to listen to DJs or anything like that. That's not really ever been my scene. I love going to live music. I love techno music and house music and dance music, but I've never really gone to the club to listen to it. But I started to understand how there were songs that I didn't necessarily like or even think were that great, but got super popular because of like club scenes. And it's usually because of like the experience associated with that song. Maybe you just had a really fun night at the club and that song was part of it. And so that song continues to be, or a song is just a certain amount of fun in certain settings where it might not have been as fun in another setting. So I think there's something to be said about different experiences involving music, increasing your appreciation for different types of music. I think if you might not really understand the appeal of swing music unless you got into swing dancing at some point, or really understand the appeal of certain types of house music unless you understand like the lineage that led there. Or I'm just spitballing examples here, but my point is it's everything's, sometimes context is important, sometimes it can be detrimental, but I think there's different types of music for different types of situations. We don't often sit around and listen to movie scores unless we associate that movie with good feelings. And I think about the interview that I had with J. Roddy Walston, where he was talking about the Wayne's World soundtrack. And if you haven't listened to that, go back and listen to it. Hit subscribe, all that good stuff. But Roddy was talking about how initially they were listening to the Wayne's World soundtrack just because they loved the movie. They wanted to capture the feeling that they had when they watched the movie, he and his friends. They ended up loving a lot of the music from the soundtrack just because they had listened to it so much. And it's objectively mostly a fantastic music. There's no reason that's a surprise that they ended up liking that music. But the point is how they got there. And how they got there was because they were trying to capture the experience of the movie again. It wasn't like back then, it wasn't like now where you could just pop the movie on streaming anytime you wanted. Like, they had all seen it in the theater one summer, and they got the soundtrack, and that made them re-experience the film again. And then they ended up loving the music from the soundtrack. So I think that type of experience is pretty universal, just depending on the situation, right? There could just be a song that reminds you of something very personal that you really like, or it could just be some weird association with a fun time, or it could just be because you have affinity for the goddamn song and you don't have to justify it to anybody. But my point is that when you shut yourself off to certain experiences or certain types of music because you haven't had certain, I think you're probably doing yourself a disservice. But it also makes sense to me why there's certain music that certain people just won't really see the appeal of unless they've had certain experiences that go along with it. And that kind of leads me, Beat Saber, I just want to talk about that for another minute. The level design in that game is beautiful. Each artist typically has its own themed background. There's a Queen song pack that I think of that has fantastic backgrounds and level design. And the game's just a lot of fun, and you get lost in your own little world of dance. And I've got thunder here, so I'm going to get off here in just a second. But what I wanted to talk about mainly to end this with is application more than anything than a game in virtual reality as well, called Tribe XR. Tribe XR is actually a DJ simulation suite that gives you access to virtual versions of full Technics turntables and CDJs and professional grade equipment using your own music library, and has real life DJs that will meet with you in VR and give you lessons. Is this a game or is this a training module, or does it matter? Because you can get in there and just play and have fun, but you are working with real equipment. I think you are learning skills that are transferable to the real world when you use the same type of equipment. And I'll leave a link in the description of this episode for Tribe XR. I think it's really worth checking out. Tribe XR has a whole community surrounding it. DJs having sets with people in the room, in the virtual room with them, sharing the same virtual space. And if you've never done virtual reality, I know this is hard to comprehend to an extent, but I think when you hear my interview that's coming up in a few weeks with Tommy Simbazo, who is a comedian who hosts an open night comedy night every Monday night, but has also done a lot of professional work, has opened for people like Stavros. He's done Stavros' podcast. I believe his nipple became viral on that podcast. I don't mean that he caught a virus. I mean that it went really popular on the interweb. But what I will say is that when you're sharing a space with a person, your suspension of disbelief is pretty great that you're not in the same room until you try and actually touch them. Yes, you might be talking to a cartoon version of them, but you feel like you're sharing a physical space. You can interact with the same space and objects in that space, the same people in that space. And so these DJ sets in Tribe XR, done by DJs with people in the room watching them, are quite interesting and very much feel like you're in the room with a real DJ. They are real DJs. It's really interesting, though, where VR has gone. And I think it's gone more direction of things like music games, like Beat Saber, I don't think will ever die completely. Community type things like VR, chat, and then you have Horizon Worlds and some of those other social platforms. And then Really, at its core, Tribe XR is also a social platform. But having these communities surrounding music in games, in VR, just makes sense to me. There's actually raves in virtual reality, in VR chat, with live DJs and light shows that you couldn't even create in real life. And my point is just that music has been an integral part of gaming, and now gaming is becoming an integral part of music. And I'm not even sure where the line is when it comes to something like Tribe XR. I highly encourage you to check out all of the games I've talked about today. If there's a music game that you love that I have not talked about, shoot me an email at feddunxr@gmail.com. That's feddunxr@gmail.com. Tell me about the game that I missed. I'll play it, and I'll talk about it in a sequel episode to this one. Make sure to come back later this week for my interview with Levi Crumley. We talked for almost 2 hours, trimmed out some of the fat, the ums, the uhs, got it down to about 90 minutes. I'm going to release this one in one chunk for you guys. Try something a little different. I've split up my previous interviews. I'm going to put this one out in one episode and see what happens. And then next week, we're going to have Sloan Simpson from the Sloan Brothers. He's going to talk about how he never plays live music and still manages to work with some of the most amazing artists out there. He'll talk also about his project with Jay Gonzalez of the Drive-By Truckers. And then Jay Gonzalez in a couple of weeks will be on the show. We got a lot planned for you guys, so make sure you hit that subscribe button. This has been Overeducated and Underemployed. I'm Feddun. Have a great day.
Wayfair's Labor Day clearance is here. Right now, score up to 70% off everything home, plus fast shipping on everything right to your door. Shop now through September 2nd at wayfair.com.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Save big during Labor Day at Lowe's. Get up to 40% off select major appliances. Plus, buy more to get up to an additional 20% off. Shop even more savings with 3 Stay Green 1 cubic foot vegetable and flower garden soil bags for $10. This Labor Day, take care of your home for less at Lowe's. We help, you save. Valid through 9/3. Soil offer excludes Alaska and Hawaii. Selection varies by location. Select locations only. While supplies last. See Lowe's.com for more details.